black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and for those of you who are new to this show, the purpose of the Umoja Circle is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. And also, one of the reasons that I started this show, because I came to this understanding, and it's going to be based on the person we'll be talking about today. But I want to say that one of the founding ideas of this show is that through dialogue, there can be a shift in consciousness. And when there's a shift in consciousness, there's a shift in your particular world. Okay? And at the beginning of before we came on air, you heard a little speech by this person that I'm going to be talking with my guest with today, and that's Brother Malcolm X, or El Hajj Malik El-Shabaab, as he's also known as. And he's a very dynamic and interesting person. Though he is, like, to me, he's one of my guiding stars through life. And like any star in the night sky, even though it might have been exploded and gone, the light that's given off by that exploded star still travels across the firmament of the sky. And for me, the light that he gave, even though he's long gone these many years, is still traveling across the firmament of my mind, which is my inner universe, you know. So before I get started, I would like to introduce my guest, Baba Anda Ma'ak. Welcome, brother.
Well, I always appreciate it, brother.
Thank you. And like me, this brother here, I think Malcolm, you could say, is one of your guiding stars too,
yeah,
right?
Definitely one of my cultural heroes, and has had a tremendous impact on my life. Just reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and just being...
we got a copy of it right here in front of him.
Because it has really impacted and transformed my thinking in many ways when I was a younger man.
I heard a lot of people that I've come through the years that I've talked to while I was in the military or in college, they said the same thing about reading this book.
Yes.
You know, I've read this book too, yes. Mm-hmm. So this model, he to me, he's one of my favorite when it comes to social critics. Okay, he is to me the paradigm. We have to have in our community models of images of people who can articulate what we think and what bothers us in this. And Malcolm is one of those people that we could always go back to, like I said, the guiding star to find him.
Because I found Malcolm being very relatable.
Yes.
You know, going through his different stages of life, which I think is relatable to the fact that as black men in America,
we can relate
males,
we
can relate to it.
But we're all in that same system.
Yes.
He's a reflection of us in some ways. Let's talk about the early stages of him first before we go on to his philosophical influences on our minds, which is, I think, is a very important part of this dialogue that we're having. Mm-hmm. He was born in, most of the time you hear people coming from the Caribbean or coming from one of the biggest cities, Philly and New York, many of our heroes, or Washington, D.C., around that area. Yeah. But he was born in Omaha, Nebraska, right?
That's right, yeah. Of course, May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. And it's very interesting because his mother was from Grenada, the British West Indies.
That West Indian connection, like Marcus.
Yes,
Garvey,
exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, his father, Earl, was from Reynolds, Georgia. And it's interesting because he talks about it and it's highlighted in the autobiography, but it mentions the fact that his father had 5 brothers and 4 of his brothers had been murdered.
What? I see. That's something new to me. I forgot that part. You know, you just brought that to light. Yeah.
So, you know, I say that because it speaks of that early tragedy because, you know, and we was just mentioning the fact that at 4, their home was burnt to the ground.
Better Ku Klux Klan.
At 6, his father was murdered.
In 1931.
By the age of 12. Now, his mother had a nervous breakdown trying to maintain the family. So now Malcolm grows up in state institution boarding homes. And of course, you know, that leads him to the streets, you know.
Well, like a lot of our young men that we still know this, we can see. But see, when you look back at his life, like we said earlier, he is a potential. And like all our young black men that we try to discard or point at, but he had in a place where you might not think this thing called manhood came into being. Can you tell us about where did he go? What he was in the streets?
Well, you know, and that's when that phase of maleness.
Yes.
We're out in the street, we're searching. Of course, he has some part-time legal and illegal activities. Of course, he worked as a shoe shine boy, a trained box boy, a bar waiter. And then he also found himself in the streets as a dope peddler.
That's the little red part of it. What do you call that? That was the term because it was reddish here. Yeah.
Yes. Well, yeah, because Detroit Red, they referred to him as because he had spent time in Lansing, Michigan, which is near Detroit, and he had reddish brown hair. So now you refer to him as Detroit Red.
The street colloquialism. Yeah.
And it's interesting because you see the name changes that Malcolm go through. Of course, born Malcolm Little, and now Detroit Red. And
searching.
Searching. And
identity.
Then when he finds himself, of course, in prison, of course, some refer to him as Satan because he had really kind of anti-religious attitude.
Yeah, he would challenge those
that's
preachers that would come to them to teach Jesus, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the thing is, and I think, you know, what we really realize is that at the early stages, you have that lack of formation because his father, again, had been murdered.
Traumatized.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So now you searching, and many of us are searching.
Who am I? What is my purpose? Why am I here?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in prison, of course, he's introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And from there, you start to see the transformation because he goes into what both of us, I think, appreciate. And that is he starts to study, he starts to read, he starts to acquire knowledge. And that really is the transformation.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because, and I was going to relate that to, you know, we was having a conversation. We always talking. Yeah. But the idea when you had talked about the
established order logic.
Yeah, well, the cocoon. And you're talking about the caterpillar going into the space.
Yeah, there's a difference. I always say that there's a difference between a male and a man. We always throw out this thing about he's a man because he's 6'2" or 17-year-old. He's acting like a man. No, manhood is different than maleness.
Yes.
Maleness is a biological phase, okay? I equate it to a caterpillar. A caterpillar crawls along on its belly and it consumes.
Yes.
And that's the male part of us. We always consume it. From the time we were little children, we go and we want to be fed. And I'm not saying that's evil or wrong, but that process you have to develop and grow into. That caterpillar, before it became the butterfly, it had to go through a cocooning process.
Yes.
And the cocooning process, and the example of Malcolm is the knowledge that you get. We got to cocoon our young males into men. Men is the way your mind goes. A male is where your body goes.
And I think that's an excellent example because very much we gonna grow physically. Because we just going to consume food. We're going to do those things.
We're going to take from women. We're going to take from the community.
Yeah.
It's not about the drugs that we sell is not about helping the community, it's about helping ourselves. So a maleness, you could be 50 years old and still have the mentality of a male.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that cocooning, because that's what we have, that's why, how many ethnic groups are there in Africa? But each one of them have some kind of process that develops the needs of the society, whether the male process or the female process, into the maleness or the woman that society needs. And everybody have to have that, and that's rites of passage.
And that's it. It's the rites of passage, because we have to prepare to become men.
Exactly.
We're not born into the world. We're born into the world with the capability of being men.
Potential.
With the potential.
Yeah.
But the idea is we have to be trained. We have to be educated. We have to be given knowledge
that you're part of. Exactly. Now, because if you're a male, okay, this thing called a male, there's human males, but there's also male dogs, male cats, male elephants. What separates a male elephant and dog and cat and human is how they think.
That's right.
And how whatever the group that they are part of, what is the pride for the lions, there is a process that from that little cub there's a nuisance and it's cute into what that society needs. And you have to have that. African people have been doing that for thousands of years. But we got disconnected from that,
and that's the point.
From enslavement. And that's what people don't realize. And we're doing like Malcolm was doing, as the little, we're still trying to find who we are.
And that's the thing with Malcolm, and that's why his life is so important.
Exactly.
Is that Malcolm experienced what most of us experience in this kind of society. We were brought here to be made into slaves. Now, we make the distinction because we were enslaved Africans. We never lost our identity.
No.
We never lost our connection to our culture and our history as African people, but we were enslaved. But we were brought here to be enslaved and made into slaves. And we have fought that. And that's where Malcolm come forward, because Malcolm had raised a question and said, who are you? Where were you? What did you once have? What was your name? Why don't you know your name? Where did you go? Where's your history? And how did someone wipe out your history? Malcolm, through his learning, he started to raise these questions. And I think Malcolm turned into one of our greatest teachers.
He is a teacher. That's the part that I want to emphasize on this dialogue, is that we call him the established order. And I'll tell you why I call the system that we're in the established order. And that's what Malcolm was coming up against. Because when you said when we were brought over here, we weren't brought over here to be doctors or lawyers or nurses or teachers. We were brought over here to be a permanent working force. Okay, when people, let me talk about that established order logic. It works like this, and this is what Malcolm had to deal with as a child, and all of us still dealing with it to this very day. Right. The established order logic is the logic of I wrote this down, of the dominant group's logic that they use to justify the social system that they constructed to maintain their domination over other groups in that society. That's what those Africans who came over, who were Igbo, Hausa, Fani, all these different ethnic groups that had their own way of expressing themselves, their own rites of passage, their own sense of manhood.
That's right.
And we came over here to this system, and the system that we are. And what I think about the Malcolm and the established order logic, it is the way we were conditioned to believe by that system, the logic of the system that we are taught in school. That's the founding fathers and all the settlers that were going across the plains, ignoring the native people, ignoring the people that the Constitution we're told about, George Washington, and all those folks who own people that are like us. Yes. But we don't get that logic.
No, not at all, because, see, we were brought here to be enslaved, but in order to enslave a people, you have to rob them of knowledge of self. You have to strip them of their self-knowledge, self-confidence, self-worth. in order that you may have domination and control over them. So this has been our experience. But the beautiful thing about Brother Malcolm is that as he started to study and he was able to articulate that and help us to really understand what we had gone through and why we're in the condition that we're in at that time and today, because as you know, Brother Malcolm, words and ideas are timeless, because we find ourselves in the same condition that Malcolm talked about 60-some years ago.
If you don't learn the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat it. And how he came up with a way of dealing with that, that the established order logic gave it a title. They're always going to come up with their definitions. And if we don't recognize that, because he said, and the way he, in all his speeches, is always in opposition to that logic. That's why they reacted the way they react to him in a negative way, or he's dangerous. No, what that Malcolm X, when he became that man, was not a danger to society. He was a man is a person who understands the needs of the community.
You know, and I think, and I appreciate what you just said, because in the society, a dominant society that oppresses people, anyone that challenges and awakens people to think, they see it as a person of danger. Now, Malcolm, of course, and this is always important to highlight, Malcolm was never arrested in the sense of after his imprisonment time. He didn't go out breaking laws. He didn't go out carrying weapons. It was his thinking that became a danger to this society, which shouldn't be, because if we're honest, education is about what? Awakening the minds of people. And Malcolm was he was so profound in the way he was able to articulate and bring up the hypocrisy in the world we live in.
And that's what oppositional logic did.
Exactly.
That's what I call his way of speaking and what he was trying to teach. In his speeches, everything that he said was in opposition to the oppressor. You cannot be an oppressed person and think like the people that are oppressing you. So your logic got to be in opposition. That's what he was saying. And that's what they took as a danger, because it woke people up.
And the beautiful thing about Brother Malcolm, you used to say, make it plain. Malcolm had the ability to articulate it and put it right in your face and say, look here, this is what you've been taught, and this is what is the truth. So now you look at this. And the beautiful thing about it, to be a really impactful teacher, you have to have confidence in the ability of the people to think.
Thank you.
And Malcolm believed in us in the sense that he could share information with us and awaken us to think. Just think. Because if you get me to thinking, I will see the hypocrisy and I can make a decision on what I need to do and what
that's the first stage of unity as a people. If we are confused, like the younger Malcolm phase, how are we going to come together if we're in that stage of the caterpillar part of us, just consuming? We're not going to be able. You could talk to young men out there who haven't been through the process of awakening with the knowledge that Malcolm said, and the only way you can know that knowledge is by understanding the history, the precedent, what got us to this point. You cannot understand the present moment, Malcolm was always say, unless you understand how did we get here.
Exactly. And just something as simple as the idea of names. Malcolm said, what's your name? Why don't you know your name? Where did it go? Who took it and how did they take it? And then he said, see, Lumumba is a good name. And Nkrumah is a good name. And what he was trying to get us to help us to relate to is that we are people of African descent. And these are some of the names that we had on the continent of Africa.
That we got to reconnect to.
Now, what kind of names do we have today? So the idea is that Malcolm was always able to just put those things on the table for us and help us to see more clearly. And I think to this very day, if we listen to the words of Brother Malcolm and hear what he's saying, then we can start to break through some of these things we are dealing with even today. We can see the hypocrisy. We can see the oppositional logic. And we can start to make clear decisions. Because, see, it was never about forcing ideas on us. It was never about me telling. I don't think Malcolm was trying to tell us, this is what you need to do. Malcolm was really just saying, look here, this is what you see in the world, and you have to make a decision. Do you want to be a black man, or do you want to just be an oppressed person in a slave mind?
Let's go on that point to extend. And you also this brother was always deep, Malcolm, because there is a point where we say we're black, right?
Yeah.
But Malcolm will say, do you know what it means to be black? Yeah. That's a difference between ontology, and I'm like Malcolm. I'm gonna put words out there. You go out. I trust the knowledge of our people. Ontology is about being, the beingness. We're a human being, okay? But epistemology, which is the source of that knowledge, okay? I'm being. He said. I think I heard this one time. Said that. I think it might have been Malabar Karenga who said this one time. I heard many years ago. He said, feeling pain, being in pain doesn't make you a doctor. Okay? Because when you can feel all the pain you want, you could be in pain, but to be a doctor requires study, requires knowledge, requires understanding the history of medicine, all the things that could make you so you could deal that pain. And we are the people who are in pain today, whether we know it or not, consciously or unconsciously. Right. Only way that we can fix this is knowing who we are. And that requires thinking. To know requires thinking. Thinking requires study.
Yes. And I think if there's anything that we can take from the life of Brother Malcolm, is that Malcolm was about study. He was studious.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
Of course, you hear the idea that he read the dictionary from A to Z. He read all these books from, The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois.
All the great scholars, who are in our pantheon of heroes, who our guiding stars, John Henry Clark. Yeah. People don't realize the great John Henry Clark was an advisor to Malcolm during his time.
But see, that's wise because, all of us bring information and knowledge to the table.
Thank you.
So Brother Malcolm was in contact with people who were scholars. He wanted to have that information that they had. And I've heard Dr. Clark had mentioned one time, of course, Dr. Clark is one of our great ancestor historians, but he had mentioned the idea that Malcolm would take the information that he shared with Brother Malcolm after he had done some research, and Malcolm would take that information, read through it, and be able to articulate it and make it plain and break it down and share it with people.
That's why he's my role model, because that's how I try to do things on the show. Because in order for me to I'm going on my 30th year, and every day during that period of time, I had to study in order to have what we're talking about. This ain't just coming out of the what we are talking about. It came from books. It came from study, and you can't circumvent that. I know in this day of quick microwave stuff, in order for you to know, you got to think, and in order for you to think, you have to study.
Yes.
That's Malcolm's message.
Exactly. So the idea was to wake people up, get them to think, get them to clean themselves up, and get them to stand up as men and women and build the kind of world we want to live in. So Malcolm, of course, was and is one of my great cultural heroes, because Malcolm gave me, in all honesty, the formula to transformation. See,
when you set a mind, that mind will pull the body into whatever direction you set it at.
Yes.
Okay? And it's always about the mind first. The world takes shape in our minds.
Well, and that's beautiful, because I think that's the point, is that men and women create the world they want to live in, but it comes from our minds, our thinking.
Thank you.
So what we have suffered and been really oppressed by is that we live in someone else conceived world in their minds.
Established order, logic.
Exactly. So now Malcolm comes along and says, no, this is the world that they have created. And in their world, then you just an oppressed person, you an enslaved person, you are a servant to the
That's what they were trying to create us. And everything in that system that we're talking about, again, it's still ingrained in us, again, to talk about the Constitution again. Okay? For example, that's a nice document, but just like Frederick Douglass said in the 1850s when he was asked to speak about on the Declaration, 4th of July.
Yes.
Didn't he say from an oppositional logic thing?
Yeah.
What did the 4th of July have to do with me? But the established order logic is saying we have parades and, we got our children dressed up as George Washington in kindergarten. How is that good for the people that had nothing to do with that, whose ancestors were enslaved by George Washington? So you see the dichotomy. Until we come from an us point of view, we're told we the people. No, it's us as an interest group that bring forth what we need in this thing called the we.
If anything, Malcolm's taught us that we are in a world where we are basically encouraged not to think.
Thank you.
Not to challenge, not
Just
to
to
be in
react.
opposition.
Yeah.
It's just to follow instructions. And that's the way the educational system is set up. And that's a whole nother discussion. But the idea is that Malcolm was saying, no, you need to think. You need to question the world you're living in. And you need to see the opposition to what it is.
You got to come from a different, an oppositional thinking. And that's what he was trying to, the underlying things of all his speeches. He always used history. He always says you must study. But he means that you got to know what you're up against. The lights is, the history illuminates the present.
And y'all know you've heard this quote, but Malcolm said, of all of our studies, history is most qualified to reward our research.
That's what he means. I know a lot of people read that and really don't get what it means. He's talking about that you're going to build up a logic that is, and the more you know about our system, what it was felt like to be forced on those plantations, where you got to, people picking a cotton ball, a cotton ball is light. But when you had to pick 200 pounds of that and a field, that is vast, that picks them, and we're supposed to be American citizens. And that's our history here in America. And we got disconnected from the ancient history of the people that were kidnapped.
That's right.
We weren't immigrants, came over with some kind of cruise ship. We were kidnapped and brought over here to be a permanent working force.
And that's why Malcolm say we didn't come here on the Pinta, the Santa Maria, or the Mayflower. We was brought here in the enslaved ships. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us.
And we're going to continue from this moment, and we're going to do a part 2. So I hope you understand why we are talking about this great man, why he is important to us as a people to know and understand. You cannot help but understand the present moment and who you are, without study. And that's what Malcolm was talking about. That's what he was talking in that speech that started this show, which was a famous speech, The Ballad and the Bullet. And we're going to talk about those things that he was talking about in that, because it has a lot to do with what we're talking about now. So until next time, peace, Hotep, bye-bye.